I love Breath of the Wild. The Nintendo Switch was the first next-generation console I had ever owned, and I got it along with Super Mario Odyssey on Christmas in late 2017. Shortly after, I would pick up Breath of the Wild, and it would quickly become one of my most played games ever. I played through it once, and then played through it again to get all the shrines, and then again, and again, and again, and then again on Master Mode. It's easy to say that I was obsessed, and for good reason. Breath of the Wild's world is tantalizing, and nearly everything about it begs for you to come and take a look, leading you down a nearly endless rabbit hole of distractions and possibilities. Just the ability to climb nearly anything alone makes the game stand out as something truly special. Seeing something in the distance, reaching it, and then climbing to its top is truly a joy like no other. And it all feeds into this amazing sense of discovery and exploration as you wander the vast, wild world of Hyrule. To this day, there is no other game I've played that captures the same feeling as playing Breath of the Wild does. Even Elden Ring, a game that takes many steps forward in the open world genre, does not supply the player with the freedom that exploring Breath of the Wild does. Today, I have over 400 hours in Breath of the Wild, a true testament to how rich its world can be. So when the sequel to Breath of the Wild was announced at E3 in 2019, I couldn't have been more ecstatic. That being said, however, Breath of the Wild is not a perfect game. Despite its glowing reception, I think it's important to note that there are several key issues that tend to hold it back. As I got older, I grew more and more aware of each and every one of these issues, each of which I hoped would be rectified in the upcoming sequel. For 4 years, I have waited for that sequel, in earnest anticipation of a game that could surpass the flaws of Breath of the Wild, a game with the potential to be even better. I'm still waiting for that game, because The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is not it. After playing through Tears of the Kingdom, I cannot fully express how disappointed I was with my experience, an experience marred by the same glaring flaws that I had originally encountered 6 years prior. The purpose of this review is to discuss those issues, as well as to highlight the issues I have with the game overall. And no, this isn't meant to be some angry rant about why I think Zelda and Nintendo suck. It's to express what I think are legitimate criticisms about the game. Since this is my first YouTube video, I'm also hoping that it will make a clear impression of the things I like and dislike when it comes to video games, and the Zelda series as a whole. That way you, the audience, can gain a better understanding of the type of person I am, for better or for worse. I say that because I get the feeling this video might be quite divisive, so I'd like to give out a fair warning ahead of time. If you love Tears of the Kingdom, then this video probably isn't for you. I'm going to be criticizing the majority of the content in the game, so if you don't want to hear that, then I would highly suggest clicking off now. That also means I'll be spoiling almost the entirety of the game as well. That being said, if you do like Tears of the Kingdom but are willing to hear a different perspective, then continue on. You might want to strap in though, because I've got a lot to cover. Let's start at the beginning. Tears of the Kingdom opens with an introductory gameplay segment where the player once again takes control of the legendary swordsman Link, this time tasked with protecting the princess as you explore the newly found depths beneath Hyrule Castle. This essentially boils down to following Zelda around as she takes pictures of the surrounding architecture and briefly commentates on it, and it serves as a way to get the player acquainted with the basic controls. Already, I feel like this section of the game is a significant step backwards from Breath of the Wild's opening, an unfortunate theme which I feel plagues Tears of the Kingdom up until its very end. Breath of the Wild's short introduction is straightforward and to the point. It easily teaches a new player the basic controls of the game by having them perform a few basic tasks before releasing them into the actual tutorial, while also allowing returning players to quickly skip through it to get to the actual content of the game. Not only is Tears of the Kingdom's intro far longer, it also needlessly wastes a returning player's time by forcing them to slowly wait for Zelda to catch up to them. You might already be thinking to yourself that Tears of the Kingdom's longer intro is justified because of its heavier focus on the game's story. which I would completely agree with if I felt that the game's story was interesting enough to experience on every playthrough. I'm completely fine with Twilight Princess's far more prolonged and hand-holding opening because I actually enjoy the story that the game is trying to tell. If I thought that what was to come in regards to the story was good, then I would probably quite like this intro, which, if that isn't already a clear enough indicator of my thoughts on Tears of the Kingdom's story already, then I don't know what is. Though I'll get into that later. Despite some of my misgivings, I do think the atmosphere and music during this section is quite great, and add well to the tone that is already being presented. After another cutscene revealing Ganondorf's return, Link wakes up to... Whoops, wrong game. Link wakes up to find that his arm has been replaced by a new one, which will serve as the catalyst for Tears of the Kingdom's core gameplay changes. And after a short series of tutorials... Oh, sorry about that. Here we go. After a short series of tutorials and the introduction to one of Link's new abilities, the dive, the full scope of the world is finally revealed to the player with a gorgeous, full-scale cutscene. I'm really sorry about that. There we go. Jeez, it's almost like these two intros are so similar that I can't even distinguish the difference between them. Anyway, after landing in a pond, Tears of the Kingdom's tutorial finally begins. This is the Great Sky Island, and on it the player will learn the various mechanics of the game, namely the specifics of exploration, combat, stamina, puzzle solving, shrines, Link's new abilities, environmental effects, and... Alright, let's cut the crap. If it wasn't already obvious by my editing, Tears of the Kingdom's tutorial area is painstakingly similar to Breath of the Wild's Great Plateau, and it copies nearly every single beat. They even have the exact same names. As a sequel to Breath of the Wild, obviously Tears of the Kingdom will carry over a lot of the previous game's mechanics, and naturally they need to be explained. But to explain them in the exact same way as before feels incredibly lazy and disappointing for someone who has already played the first game. Not only that, but I feel that Tears of the Kingdom does it in a substantially worse manner. But to better express my point, let me explain why I think the Great Plateau works in the first place. I don't think it would be much of an overstatement to say that the Great Plateau is a masterpiece of game design, which perfectly reflects the overall structure and spirit of Breath of the Wild. The natural and subtle terrain alone helps solidify the name of the game, that feeling of being lost in the wild which Breath of the Wild constantly relishes in. There are forests, plains, ancient structures and buildings, lofty cliffs to climb, snowy mountains, and swift rivers, all things which the player will eventually come to explore on a much grander scale. The Great Plateau is essentially a miniature version of Hyrule, allowing the player to get used to what to expect from the rest of the game without overwhelming them. The open design gives the player ultimate initiative, allowing them to tackle the various challenges that the Great Plateau has to offer in a myriad of unique and interesting ways, and it's for this reason that no two people who play through this area will have the same experience. But for the Great Sky Island, there's only two possible ways to experience it: forward or backwards. This is because of how incredibly linear the area is, a bizarre choice for a tutorial in a game that's meant to be open world. This is because the Great Sky Island is in the shape of a giant circle connected at each end by the Temple of Time, as if there weren't enough similarities already. This means that every player will go down one side of the circle in a straight line until they eventually come back to the beginning of the loop, doing every shrine in the exact same order. Using my experience, let's go through it step by step. I followed the game's direction and went to the first shrine, learned the shrine ability and tested it outside, explored a small grove, built a boat to get across some water, did another shrine, found a cave, fought a mini-boss, went through a snowy mountainous area, did another shrine, flew back to the Temple of Time, and then went back to find another shrine. I guarantee that nearly every single person's playthrough of the Great Sky Islands after going to the Temple of Time went exactly the same way. It conveys the same information as the Great Plateau, but is designed like a series of boxes for the developers to check off before dumping the player into the world. And if you do go the opposite direction, it feels like you're playing the game wrong. If you go towards the snow biome, the game initially tries to correct this by giving you the same bow tutorial that you'll find the normal way, but after getting Ascend, it attempts to lure you back towards the Temple of Time with a glider. If you try to keep pushing in the opposite direction, then you'll experience reverse tutorials, exploring areas that reinforce ideas you learn in a shrine before even doing that shrine, and eventually you'll be stopped by a body of water with wind blowing in the opposite direction. For a game that shares the exact same world as the first game, I can't help but feel that this tutorial is much more inferior. Maybe, instead of doing the Great Plateau Great Value Edition, the developers could have leaned more into the island aspect of the area, and had the player choose which islands to go to in whatever order. Not only will this be much more original, but it's a design choice that is literally found throughout the game whenever there are clusters of sky islands together. Here the player is given the freedom to explore whichever one they want to first, and it feels a lot more natural. As it stands, the Great Sky Island feels like a shallow copy of something that truly deserved to be called great. Regardless, there are still two new things to talk about that are introduced in the tutorial. Firstly, the new abilities that Link gets, and secondly, Zonai devices. Breath of the Wild's rune system was a great addition to the game, and in Tears of the Kingdom it is followed up by an entirely new selection of abilities, which Link acquires through his new arm. While I still miss Breath of the Wild's runes, this was undoubtedly a change that needed to happen, as it serves as the core gameplay change between the two games. Let's start with undoubtedly the most prominent new addition, Ultra Hand. Ultra Hand essentially serves as a replacement for Breath of the Wild's Magnesis, but rather than being able to pick up only metal items, the player is now given the freedom to pick up just about every single item in the game, no matter what it's made of. This includes the new Zonai devices, objects like wheels, carts, gliders, rockets, steering sticks, stabilizers, and much more. These items alone don't tend to be very useful, but when combined with Ultra Hand's second feature, the ability to attach one item to another, it unlocks a treasure trove of potential. With these things combined, and a bit of ingenuity, you can even create vehicles, which can range from ground-based ones to flying ones, or even both. If you can think it, you can make it, or at least try to, even if it sucks. It's one of Tears of the Kingdom's most defining features, and there are now hundreds of videos out there of people making insane things with it. I personally find it a great addition as well, and it made exploring a world I had already seen at least a bit more interesting. That isn't to say that Ultra Hand and vehicles are perfect, however, as I do have a few gripes here and there. Firstly, I think vehicles negatively impact the usefulness of horses, so much so that I barely even use them throughout the entire game. Before I found too many batteries, I actually thought the two were balanced out, with horses being the faster and more reliable option, and vehicles slower but better for exploration-based activities. But once you have enough batteries, there is absolutely no reason to use a horse, as vehicles can move just as fast and become even more efficient. They even attempted to upgrade horses by letting them pull wagons, but it absolutely pales in comparison to how much you can carry with a vehicle. Along with this, I also feel like Ultra Hand can be a bit cumbersome at times. There are plenty of times when I was trying to build a structure or vehicle and a part would just attach to the wrong place, resulting in me having to shake it off and potentially break off another piece as well. I don't know what the solution to this problem is, but nonetheless, it's annoying. And finally, I don't understand why they decided to make using the glider timed. If they were trying to not make flying too overpowered, then they still failed, because there are still dozens of ways to make flying vehicles that aren't affected by a timer at all, and can be infinitely refueled with batteries. All that is accomplished is making it more of a hassle to go long distances, as the glider is the fastest. The ability players are most likely to get next is Fuse, which comes with a similar amount of baggage as Ultra Hand, namely how it addresses the weapon durability system. Breath of the Wild's durability system was one of its most debated features, and while I generally like its overall implementation, it was an undoubtedly flawed mechanic. This comes mostly from hoarding and weapon value, with the former causing many players to never use their better weapons for fear of breaking them, and the latter causing players to outright avoid enemies, as the reward for doing the fight was not worth the materials spent. Because of this, the durability system absolutely had to be addressed in the next game, and while the new Fuse ability certainly does this, I feel like it's only a half solution. With the Fuse ability, you can now attach different objects to your weapons, a feature which becomes a necessity in lieu of most untampered weapons having a low base damage. This includes stones, Zonai devices, and even other weapons, but most importantly, monster parts. This ensures that every encounter with an enemy will always give you something to make new weapons with, and as the enemies scale in difficulty, their drops become more and more powerful. At the very least, this makes enemies more worth fighting, as they will mostly give back what you put into beating them, and I won't deny that finding different fuse combinations for your weapons is very satisfying. However, the weapons you get are still just as brittle as they've always been, and although fusing weapons does increase their durability, it's so minimal that it barely makes a difference. And once again, I found myself not using some of my better weapons, and because they were made of such rare materials, they were hardly ever worth spending in a fight. But probably the most disappointing thing is the lack of any permanent weapon. This is a problem that Breath of the Wild desperately needed solved, because if you ran out of weapons during a fight, then there was barely anything you could do, aside from slowly whittling away an enemy's health bar with bombs. So when the trailers for Tears of the Kingdom started coming out, a lot of people, including myself, saw the broken Master Sword and thought that it might be a permanent low damage weapon that Link can slowly level up over time. That way, if the player ever runs out of weapons, they always have a backup. Surprise, surprise, this didn't happen, and not only was it a completely missed opportunity, it was also a bafflingly stupid decision considering that Link doesn't have infinite bombs anymore. So if you run out of weapons now, there is literally nothing you can do offensively until you get a Sage. I appreciate the attempt made at trying to fix the durability system, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done. Next on the list is Ascend. I don't have as much to say about this ability, but overall I like its addition. Initially, I thought it would be an incredibly situational ability, but over time I was surprised to see how much I was using it. Not only does it allow for some interesting puzzles, but it also helps speed up climbing and exploration as well. It's a fun addition, and it works generally well, generally because it tended to encourage me to find jank in the collisions of cliffs to try and avoid climbing them. And finally, there's the recall ability, which can sort of work like stasis if you want it to, but with the added feature of being able to rewind objects back to their previous position. This is another cool addition that ended up being very useful as well, though mostly for exploration. The overworld is constantly being bombarded by falling rocks, and the recall ability allows you to ride them back up into the air. This not only helps with climbing, but can serve as a great way to get a better perspective on your surroundings. However, I think the ability is a bit underused when it comes to the puzzles, mostly because of how often Ultra Hand is used instead, which is a shame because I think it's an idea with a lot of potential. Although I said that Recall was the final ability, there are technically a few more, but they're more optional and not as major. There's the camera and amiibo functionality from the first game, but there's also a new auto build feature, an ability which can be found in the depths. Auto build allows you to save a build from memory, so that you can more quickly assemble it if you want to make it again, which in tandem with the dozens of blueprints scattered around the map, can give you a large arsenal of vehicles and builds. You can also assemble a build even if you don't have the materials, using up your Zonite ore instead. Needless to say, this ability is a godsend, allowing you to avoid the process of piecing together a vehicle every time you want to use it. I'm really glad that it's in the game. Before I move on, I want to briefly talk about some UI changes. For your abilities, you're now given a rune circle, which is a lot more efficient than Breath of the Wild's hotbar system. That isn't to say it's gone, however, as you're also given a new item hotbar. This initially seemed like a great idea to streamline fusing different items, but it ended up being fumbled by a horribly clunky interface. Rather than an organizable wheel or sublist of favorited items, it's just a straight row of every single item you've collected in the game. Trying to sift through it to find an item you need takes literal ages, and while you can sort your list by most use, that doesn't work when you need to use an item you don't use very often, or if you want to experiment. Over time, you get used to resorting your list for whatever activity you're currently doing, a band-aid solution to a UI system that genuinely needs to be improved. And with that, Tears of the Kingdom's tutorial is finally over. Not a very strong first impression, and unfortunately it doesn't get much better from here on out. After getting all of the blessings and opening the door on the Temple of Time, you are then allowed to jump down to the world below. Your next objective is Lookout Landing, located just before Hyrule Castle, and after you arrive there, it essentially becomes your central hub for the rest of the game. From here on out, the world is open for the player to explore, and for the sake of this review, that means exploring the different aspects and elements that this game has to offer. Let's get started, shall we? When it was revealed that Tears of the Kingdom would be sharing the same world as Breath of the Wild, I was initially hesitant. It felt like a bad omen to come. Of course, hindsight is 2020, but at the time I was able to convince myself that Nintendo would do something to warrant reusing the same map, and that perhaps it was necessary to make a sequel of a similar scale. I want to preface this by saying that reusing the same map for a sequel is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as the decision to keep it is justified. In fact, this was previously done in A Link Between Worlds, and it works well in that game. But to reuse such a massive map as Breath of the Wild's, Nintendo absolutely had to make some major modifications. So the question is, did they do that? Did they make enough changes to justify exploring the entire thing again? Nope, not at all. In fact, I'd argue that the vast majority of the map is exactly the same. Here's a list I compiled of all the changes to Breath of the Wild's map. Hyrule Castle is floating. Kakariko Village has ruins around it. Rito Village is snowy. Ateno Village has mushrooms. Tarrytown's layout is slightly different, and there are buildings in the swamp behind it. Lurelin Village is destroyed, but can be rebuilt. Death Mountain has no lava on the outside. Gerudo Desert has quicksand. The water in Zora's Domain is polluted, but that goes away after you do the dungeon. Gerudo Town is deserted, but that also changes once you finish the dungeon. Wow, aren't those changes worth spending $70 for? And I'm specifically talking about physical changes to the map, so the glyphs don't count, and the copy and pasted rocks that are sprinkled around are not a significant change. There's a few chasms in the ground, but they really don't change much either. Maybe I would consider them as a noteworthy change if the terrain around them was already substantially different, but it isn't. Also, notice how all of the changes are located in important story areas. It's almost like Nintendo just made changes to areas that most players will see to give them the illusion that they made changes to the rest of the world as well. I'm very open to hearing out other people's opinions, but this is one of those things that I honestly don't think I can see the other side of. And if your map doesn't look anything near like mine, then I don't even think you have a leg to stand on. If your map does look like mine and you genuinely enjoyed yourself while exploring Hyrule again, then feel free to tell me why. But to me, the map's the same. Period. And so, because of this, you always get this lingering feeling of, why am I even doing this while you're exploring? Why bother seeing what's on the other side of a hill when you already know what's there? I think this fully hit me when exploring the Thundra Plateau. Seeing such a cool area in the first game be reduced to nothing more than a single puzzle for a piece of armor was so disheartening, and it set the stage for the rest of my time exploring the overworld. Which sucks because I think reusing Breath of the Wild's map could have been a good idea. If they had made some serious alterations to the terrain, it could have been really entertaining to see how the world had changed during the upheaval. The decision to keep the map the same has also affected the locations of shrines as well. Because they're reusing the same map, they naturally can't put the new shrines in the same locations as the first game. And while it's a bit interesting to see where they've been moved to, I think this decision inadvertently lessened my enjoyment of finding them. In Breath of the Wild, it felt like the developers had utilized the world they built in the most efficient way possible to hide the shrines, and most of the spots they are put in feel incredibly optimized and fitting. This shrine next to Death Mountain is expertly tucked away amongst the terrain. This one is hidden inside of a hollowed out tree. Some even feel like the geometry was molded around them, like this one with its own island out in the middle of a lake. Because of this, the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom no longer have the luxury of being placed in their intended positions, and have now been moved to what feel like really obvious and awkward places. I mean, just look at this. There are 3 shrines right outside of Hyrule Castle that are placed in almost a straight line. It also means that a lot of previous terrain that was made specifically for shrines is now useless, like the 3 trees on top of Lenora Mountain, the giant snowbird in Hebra, or the heart-shaped opening in the perch of Rito Village. Having these massive visual indicators that lead to nothing is really, really dumb, and I wish they had either gotten rid of them or done something else with them, though they are at least visually interesting. So, what else is there to do? For starters, Tears of the Kingdom introduces caves to the overworld, an idea which, like many others, seemed promising at first, but ended up being another letdown. It's the same problem that I think Elden Ring has, in that too many of the caves are visually and functionally the same, with only a few being actually interesting. They all share the same stone and rock walls, the same enemies that hang from the ceiling, and the same general layout. There's barely anything to differentiate one from another. But unlike Elden Ring, this time around, I didn't even bother wasting my time with all of them, perhaps a fortunate lesson I learned out of an initially bad thing. It's such a monumental waste of potential, and I really wish Nintendo had taken the opportunity to hide something truly interesting in these caves, like mini dungeons or unique ruins. They're all too short, and I wish most of them could have been more complex. It would also help if there were significantly less of them, a problem I feel that a lot of open world games have. A reoccurring theme for open world devs is to cater to the most general audience, of whom most will only explore a portion of the game's content. So by sprinkling 147 caves around the world, they can ensure that most people will see at least a couple of them before finishing the game. It's the same kind of shotgun approach that applies to the Koroks as well, but where I think it works with Koroks because of their simplicity, I don't think it works for more complex tasks, especially ones that all feel the same. I understand what they're trying to do, but to me, finding one interesting and engaging cave would be far more rewarding than finding 5 mediocre ones. It's why I prefer games like Donkey Kong Country or Celeste over every other 2D Mario game. They have less levels, but they're all great. It's a less is more approach that I wish more open world games started following, but in an age where every game is competing to be bigger than the last, I doubt it'll happen anytime soon. Even though it's an obvious solution to removing empty, meaningless space and having less repetitive content. Regardless, I think the caves have one saving grace in the form of bubble gems. Bubble gems are dropped by bubble frogs, an enemy which is hidden in every cave. These gems can be given to Colton, Kilton's brother, for items and new gear, most of which is from the first game, with a few new additions, and can be purchased via bubble gems. One of which is the Satori set, a piece of armor that is advertised by Colton as your ultimate reward, and is always hanging off of his stall. It was a cool enough looking set to get me back into the caves, but even so I would mostly just run through them until I found the bubble frog. And after you obtain around 20 of them, you have enough to get all the pieces of the set, after which Colton has nothing new to sell you, effectively ending my cave exploration in the process. After you get the set, there is no reason to keep exploring, aside from a few rare pieces of armor that you can find. I actually quite like that they did this though, as most of these rare armor sets were originally amiibo exclusives in Breath of the Wild, so I'm glad they finally put them in the game without having them locked behind a physical item. Except that there's now new amiibo drops that are still locked behind physical purchases, like this Majora's Mask glider that can be obtained from the Young Link amiibo. Why? Speaking of gliding, you'll be doing it just as much as ever, perhaps even more so due in part to the new Skyview towers. These towers replace the Sheikah towers from the first game, and serve the same function of supplying the player with a map of the region. The way both games go about supplying this information is much different, however. In Tears of the Kingdom, the process has been much more streamlined, and now all you have to do is step into the tower, where you'll get launched into the air and receive the map data from a bird's eye view. This isn't exclusive to just getting the map data either. Every time you step into the tower, you will get launched. I really like this change, as it reinforces exploration of the top portion of the map, and also serves as a great way to scout out potential landmarks. It's a deserved change that fits the game. There is one little problem, however, specifically in the fact that some of these towers require you to find a way to open them or make them work. Most of these puzzles just come off as meaningless and annoying to me, but I think if the game didn't already have so many towers that you can access without a puzzle, I wouldn't feel this way. In Breath of the Wild, I always had to find my way to the top of a tower, and although some are easier than others, the reward at the top is never just given to you. So by having some be freebies, but others requiring puzzles, it ends up making me think, well, I was let into the last tower without a puzzle, so why can't I just be let into this one too? Turning any puzzle into an instant inconvenience. Just as inconveniencing are the side quests, which, just like in Breath of the Wild, worked a lot like Koroks in that most of them are entirely filler, and more often than not required players to do menial fetch quests for often poorer rewards. However, the quest log has been updated with a new category called Side Adventures, which highlights the more important side quests that are actually worth doing. That isn't to say all of these quests are perfect, but it's a definite improvement over Breath of the Wild. There are 60 of them in total, and while I certainly didn't do all of them, when I did do some of them, I never felt like I was accomplishing nothing. Since I'm here, let's also talk about Rain, since it actually relates to a side adventure. Rain in Breath of the Wild was a somewhat interesting mechanic, which required you to think differently about how to climb, whether by finding a different way around or by using well-timed jumps. I think there's an argument to be made for its inclusion, but at the same time, it could also be extremely annoying. It always seemed to come at the most inconvenient times, and sometimes there was no alternate solution. You just had to sit on a ledge and wait for the rain to stop, which destroys any sense of player progression. It's for this reason that I was kind of hoping that they would just remove the mechanic entirely in Tears of the Kingdom. They didn't, nor did they make any changes to the core mechanic. However, they did add a few extra solutions. Like I said before, Ascend and Rewind can help greatly with climbing tall mountains and structures, but there's also a new slip resistance elixir. It alleviates the problem a bit, but still doesn't entirely eliminate those frustrating moments. There's also the Froggy set, which is the reward for doing one of the side adventures, and it grants you the maximum slip resistance in the game. But to complete the side adventure, you have to go to every single stable across the entire game. It almost feels like a cruel joke, like, hey, we put in a way to make climbing in the rain easier, but you have to explore the entire map first to get it. And even when you do get it, you will still slip when climbing in the rain. Revali's Gale isn't here to help either, because all of the previous game's sage abilities have been replaced with new ones. Each of these abilities are unique to a different character. There's Tolan, who allows you to fly further horizontally rather than vertically, Yunobo, who rolls into a ball that you can throw at enemies or break rocks with, Sidon, who gives you a brief water shield almost like Daruk's protection, which can also be shot out as a projectile, and Riju, who can hit enemies with lightning after you've shot them with an arrow first. There's also a fifth sage, Minoru, who lets you ride around on a big robot that can fuse different items to its arms. These abilities are admittedly worse than the ones in Breath of the Wild, but I don't really mind that so much because they were extremely broken in the first place. Mipha's Grace gave you full hearts plus more when you died, Daruk's protection could negate all damage and reflect projectiles up to 3 times, and Urbosa's Fury could completely shred through most enemies and bosses, which could also be used 3 times. The only one that isn't so extreme is Revali's Gale, as it only helps you gain height fast, which can already be done in Tears of the Kingdom using the right abilities. I think replacing these abilities with more nerf versions was probably a good idea, as it helps make the game a bit more balanced. However, what isn't so nice is the ease of use. In Breath of the Wild, each ability was clearly mapped to its own button, or just automatic, but in Tears of the Kingdom, each new ability shares the exact same button. This is because each sage is now a physical spirit that will follow you around, so you have to interact with them first to use their ability. This works fine when there's only one of them, but once you start acquiring more and more of them, it becomes a real pain. These sages are always cluttered together, and oftentimes when you want to use one, you might accidentally use 2 others because they're in the way. Tolan's ability in particular has this problem when you're trying to pick up items, since doing both of these actions is mapped to the same button. You'll kill an enemy and try to pick up its loot, but then Tolan will suddenly get in front of you while you're pressing A and blow your items away. It can be really annoying. These sages also become a major eyesore once you acquire them all, as they will constantly crowd you while you try to explore and obscure your view. This got so bad that I actually just turned most of them off, which you can thankfully do in the menu like in Breath of the Wild. Alright, I've teased it for long enough, so let's talk about Koroks. Unsurprisingly, Koroks make a return in Tears of the Kingdom as well, which makes sense considering that it reuses the same map. This time around, there are 1,000 Koroks scattered across the land and sky, 100 more to find than in the first game. I'm completely fine with there being this many Koroks to find, because, just like in the first game, you aren't really meant to find all of them, just a few in each area you visit. And you only need around 400 of them to max out your inventory, which is less than half of the total. In Breath of the Wild, I think the reward you get reflects that, and while it would be cool if you got something more interesting out of it, it's really just meant to be a little Easter egg from the developers. I also think the process of completing such a monumental challenge is a reward in itself, and it's the reason why I'm fine with getting a postcard at the end of Mario Sunshine. It's about the journey, not the destination. The reward in Tears of the Kingdom is the exact same as well, which I'm not really a big fan of, but if you want to apply the same logic as before, you can. Still, I wish there was an actual reward this time, and chances are the people who got every Korok in Tears of the Kingdom got every Korok in Breath of the Wild too. So this time around, I wish the developers threw a bone to those people, maybe with a new outfit like the reward for getting all the shrines or something else. I will, however, criticize the reuse of the same reward from the first game. If they wanted to have a joke reward again, couldn't they have at least made a new one? It's like making the same joke twice, and it feels incredibly lazy. That being said, I actually really enjoyed the implementation of the Koroks in this game, especially the new ones. Some of the Ultra Hand shape puzzles genuinely had me scratching my head for a moment, and were a great way to expand on the block puzzles in the first game. There's also these dandelion ones that you have to jump and get. But the crowning jewel out of all of them are the backpack Koroks. These Koroks are separated from their friends and require the player to deliver them back, the process of which is not always simple. The first time I dropped one of them into a vehicle I had made and transported them back to their friend was an amazing experience, and it's a memory that I won't soon forget. In fact, the most memorable and fun moments I had in this game was when I was messing around with these Koroks, just loading them into vehicles or trying to fly them up mountains. Sometimes I would just bring them with me for no reason at all. I just thought it was funny. It's this kind of ingenuity that I wish Tears of the Kingdom had more of, finding genuinely new ways to improve on previous concepts and making them even better than before. Unfortunately, it doesn't, and it's none more apparent to me than in the upcoming area. When I first saw that Tears of the Kingdom had a third map layer in the form of the depths, I remember jokingly thinking to myself, wow, this game is way better than Elden Ring. It has 3 layers. But to compare Tears of the Kingdom's depths to Elden Ring's underground areas would be a massive disservice to Elden Ring. They're compact, but still vast enough to give you plenty of interesting things to do, while at the same time not being so large that they feel empty. I think the best example of this is the Siofra River. It starts with a short linear section, which then opens up into a larger swamp, with 5 objectives scattered around which must be interacted with in order to fight the boss. Then later, you'll access the upper half of the area. It has the player jumping across buildings to access a plaza, which leads to a mini-boss, which then leads across a bridge to a small forest overlooking a lake, and from there you can go down a hidden path to an aqueduct, or another hidden path, which leads you to an underground city. If that sounds awesome, that's because it is. And it does all of this while still being contained beneath Limgrave. This doesn't just apply to Siofra though, they're all so self-contained, and yet they surprisingly connect to one another in ways that make you question just how much there is. It's a massive rabbit hole that leads you into another underground area just as expansive as Siofra, which connects to a system of underground tunnels that lead you to yet another underground city, which itself leads to a massive underground cavern filled with rot, which you can get an early glimpse of from this underground tunnel, and then the Lake of Rot leads to an underground temple, and in that temple is a passageway to one of the coolest looking bosses in the game. And once you beat that boss, you finally take an elevator up to the Moonlight Altar without even knowing it, an area that you have seen countless times before, but were never able to get up to. It's amazing, and it's easily my favorite part of the entire game. Despite all of its flaws, the one thing I think Elden Ring does exceedingly right is its world design. The world is truly massive, but everything is so dense that you always have a new thing to go to. Jumping over a brick wall in Limgrave reveals this view of Caelid. After making your way through Stormvale Castle, you'll get this view of Liurnia and the Academy of Raya Lucaria. And after you make your way past that, you'll find the Grand Lift of Dectus, which leads you to the Altus Plateau, where you can get this view. Elden Ring's map sets a powerful precedent for future open-world games, and not only is it arguably better than Breath of the Wild, it's also better than Tears of the Kingdom's new content. My first impression of the depths was initially promising. After receiving the paraglider from Pura, I quickly jumped straight into the chasm outside of Lookout Landing, without even getting the quest from Robbie first. The harsh red of the chasm's walls and the endless darkness made for an ominous fall, and when I neared the bottom, I was suddenly greeted by this. This is a brilliant piece of sound design, and it plays every single time you enter the depths. It evokes a feeling of dread, but also a sense of adventure as well, towards this dark and unfamiliar area. The visual design of the depths is great too, a mix of bluish grays, alien plants, and giant twisted trees. It reminds me a lot of the Deep Grand Reef from Subnautica. Upon landing, I quickly lit up the surrounding area with the nearby light route, then began to make my way towards another, using my bow to light up my surroundings. I made it, but was always apprehensive of what might be lurking in the pervading darkness. I left after that, but later on I jumped down a different chasm and attempted to make my way back towards the light routes I had already been to, which I did, but not before running into this thing, which promptly sucked me up as I tried to run away from it and killed me. Unfortunately, this feeling of mystery and intrigue does not last for long, and after a dozen hours you will understand everything that the depths has to offer. Most significantly, the map for the depths isn't actually unique, it's an inverted version of the overworld, meaning that a mountain in the overworld is a pit in the depths, and vice versa. I actually think this is a pretty cool idea, and it's a great way to utilize the same map in a different way. I honestly kinda wish this was the entire game, as this is a definitive change to a previous map that justifies reusing it. However, that game wouldn't be any fun either, because of the myriad of other problems that the depths has. Remember how I emphasized how compact and self-contained the underground areas in Elden Ring were? Well, the depths do not do this. In fact, the depths span the entirety of the overworld, a stupidly ambitious decision made on Nintendo's part, and one made for no reason. Unsurprisingly, the majority of the depths is made up of vast, empty wastelands that offer nothing for the player to do. And the little space that is actually utilized is filled with copy and pasted content in the form of the aforementioned light roots, Yiga clan hideouts, small abandoned mines, and large abandoned mines. I say copy and pasted because they all feel exactly the same, and I'd wager that there's about 3 different versions of the Yiga clan hideouts, a basic one with a tree in the center, one with water around it, and a tall one, 0 variations on the small abandoned mines, and the large abandoned mines have the same layout, but sometimes different ruins around them. Oh yeah, there's also Colosseums, but these all have the same layout as well, just different enemies. Of course, there's a few exceptions to this. Off the top of my head, I can remember the abandoned mine beneath the Great Plateau being unique, and a mine full of enemies near the Akala Citadel, but again, these are very few and far between. You might have noticed that I forgot to mention the light routes, but that's because they might be the worst offender of them all. These light routes are how you obtain the maps of the depths, and since there are 120 of them in total, they only reveal a tiny sliver of the map, which is a horribly inefficient way to map out such a massive area. At first I thought I might explore the nearby areas that they lit up, but once I realized that there was nothing to do in those areas, I would just make a straight beeline towards the next one, a process made even more thoughtless by the fact that every light route is placed under an overworld shrine. This means that you can just run straight to where a shrine is on the overworld to find a light route. This makes it so easy to find light routes that at one point I stopped bothering to even light up the ground around me and would just run through the dark. Eventually I even got tired of running and just made a broken flying vehicle so that I could just fly straight from one to the next. This isn't fun. It's tedious and boring. I can only think of 2 that actually make you do something interesting to find them, and they're both surrounded by walls in order to force you to find another entrance in the overworld. Once again, I feel like all of these problems could have been solved if they had just made the map smaller. If they had sectioned out areas of the depths into smaller central zones, each one could be fully fleshed out with things for the player to do, which would also help make the depths feel more special and unique every time you entered. But to me, the depths only feel like a half-baked concept, ruined by their overly ambitious scope. I actually don't have as much to say on the sky as I did the overworld and depths, so I'll mostly just summarize. Although I think the sky has a few problems here and there, it's easily my favorite layer of the map. Despite a lot of the islands feeling kinda samey, I never felt bored or like my time was being wasted at any point, and finding ways to access other islands was always interesting and engaging. There's also a lot of repeated shrine content involving these green rocks, which you have to take back from one island to another, and although there are probably too many of them, I always enjoyed doing them. Before I got used to the gliders, one of the first puzzles I did that were like this requires the player to fly a glider to a cave on another island with a rock in it, then to build a glider that can get the rock back to the island you were just on. I was so enamored by this that I actually took 2 clips of it because I thought it was that cool, though it does start to become a routine over time. A lot of the islands have very alluring designs as well, like this tall spire island or the weird spherical Death Star looking ones. However, I was extremely disappointed by the floating cubes. They all ended up just being like the mazes that they are floating above, and all 3 of them have you do the exact same task. Find 4 terminals to open a gate in the maze below, dive through that gate into the depths, and then fight a flux construct, which always rewards the player with a piece of Phantom Ganon's set from Breath of the Wild. This process is made even worse by the fact that these floating mazes are so easy to break. All you have to do is get above them and you can easily jump down to where the terminals are without even having to do the maze. They really should have put a ceiling on top of these. There are also far too many of these floating arenas with flux constructs on them, and although I'll get more into the bosses later, fighting these things gets very old very fast, and I skipped them whenever I could. Oftentimes, the reward for fighting them is a treasure map for the depths, which is actually a pretty neat way to connect the 2 areas that encourages exploring them both. There's also a new collectible called the Sage's Will hidden on the Sky Islands, which can be used to upgrade your Sage companions, but I never ended up finding very many of them. And that's about all I have to say regarding the sky. I really appreciate how much more reserved they were when making the sky, as it's the only part of the game that I would actually want more of, a feeling that is always better than being given too much. There's also a lot of dead space in the sky, but I don't think it needs to be filled with new content. If only there was a way to compress these sky islands together and make them more compact. I think Joseph Anderson best described the combat in Breath of the Wild as fragile and inconsistent, and it's an aspect of the game that I don't think a lot of people have taken notice of. That isn't to say that it's bad. I do think that there are a lot of great things about it. However, there are also a number of glaring flaws. You might even be wondering what I'm talking about right now, but I assure you that the combat in Breath of the Wild is fundamentally unpolished and broken. Let's start with the most obvious addition to combat, the Flurry Rush. On the surface, the Flurry Rush seems like a great idea. It rewards players with extra hits for being able to properly dodge an enemy attack, and since later enemies have so much health, it becomes an essential skill to learn. The implementation, however, is not so great. But first, let me pose you a question. When trying to trigger a perfect dodge, what position do you think you should be in to trigger it? Ironically enough, the answer is already in Breath of the Wild with a parry. When an enemy swings at you, you parry when the weapon comes in contact with your shield. It's an action and a reaction that puts you in a risk versus a reward scenario, where if you miss it, you are punished accordingly. Therefore, when trying to get a perfect dodge, you should be in a position of danger to balance out the risk versus the reward. With that in mind, let's take a look at this clip. Did you see that? Maybe you missed it, so let's watch it again. Link is not in a position to receive damage from the boss, and yet the Flurry Rush activates anyways, long after he has stepped out of range of the attack. Well, maybe that's not so bad as long as the Flurry Rush still activates when Link is in danger, right? Nope, that's not how it works either. Link clearly dodges away before the weapon hits him, but the Flurry Rush does not activate. The proposed theory is that, rather than the game checking to see if Link is in actual danger, it does a check of the area around Link to see if there are any sources of active damage. This would explain why you can still get a Flurry Rush before an enemy has even swung a weapon at you, and why you can get a Flurry Rush with the weapon literally phasing through Link's body. This can also result in Link getting hit when he shouldn't have. Here, he cleanly dodges this Lionel's attack, but it doesn't activate a Flurry Rush and he gets hit by the next one. So if you've ever wondered why you aren't getting a Flurry Rush when you are clearly dodging an enemy's attack, that's why. But let's say that this system works, and you try to get a Flurry Rush but fail. So, what are your options? In Dark Souls, this means continuing the fight, or finding a place to stop and heal between attacks, meaning that you have to utilize your limited resources intelligently if you want to survive. In Breath of the Wild, you can do this. You can literally just pause the game and eat every single item you have gathered across the entire game, all while lying on the floor. There is no skill or strategy involved in this. Unless you are deliberately being stingy with your food, that makes it nearly impossible for you to die in combat, because in most situations, as long as you have full hearts, you cannot die in one hit. Seriously, go try it out for yourself. Not only should you have to physically eat these items in-game, you should only be able to eat a certain amount as well. And no eating raw ingredients either. This problem is exasperated even further if you decide to upgrade your armor. The way you upgrade your armor is through the 4 Great Fairies, who require a certain amount of materials before being able to upgrade a piece of armor. Personally, I've never done this, as I don't really think the game is hard enough to warrant getting better armor, nor do I like to grind for things in video games, with a few exceptions. But if you do fully upgrade your armor, then the combat becomes a complete joke. Rather than changing your defenses through a percentage, the game straight up negates an enemy's damage points, meaning that if you have a 36 defense armor, then an enemy with a 36 damage weapon effectively can't hurt you. 1 damage equals 1 heart. So by having a full set of upgraded armor, you can bring your defense up so high that almost every enemy in the game will only do a half a heart of damage. At that point, you neither need to dodge nor heal, and you can just tank through every hit and still be fine. All of this adds up to make the combat feel broken and unpolished. So, in Tears of the Kingdom, what is done to alleviate this problem? I think the footage speaks for itself. One major complaint towards Breath of the Wild from a lot of people was its lack of enemy variety. This is one of the few problems that Tears of the Kingdom actually attempts to address, and there are now 9 new enemy types. These include Aracudas, Evermeans, Little Frogs, Gibdos, Horriblins, Like-Likes, Boss Bokoblins, Soldier Constructs, and Captain Constructs. But I'd argue that these 3 don't really count. They're a lot like the Keese, Choo-Choos, and Octoroks of the first game, and that they all die in one hit and only really serve as a moving obstacle. Whenever you fight one, it's not really much of a fight, they just kinda die, meaning that there's really only 6 new enemies to fight. I appreciate all of these additions, however I think they make the same mistake as Breath of the Wild, and that so many of them are sectioned off from one another. In Breath of the Wild, you would always fight the same 3 types of enemies: Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizalfos. Never would you encounter them with any of the mini-bosses or guardians, unless you deliberately lured them together. And the majority of Wizrobes are isolated by themselves, which really sucks because they could add a lot of variety to encounters. There's a tower from the first game where this is done, and it makes trying to climb it a genuine challenge. You have to actually think about fighting the enemies instead of just running straight in. The same thing applies to Tears of the Kingdom as well. Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizalfos are still grouped up together, and you will hardly ever see them interact with other enemy groups. Horriblins and Like-Likes are always in caves, though some Like-Likes hang from cliffs, and although Bokoblins and Moblins can sometimes be found in caves, Horriblins always seem to be absent. I genuinely don't even know if there's a single instance across the entire game where Horriblins and Bokoblins are in the same room. So if anybody actually knows, please tell me in the comments. I'd love to be proven wrong here, but even if it's true, then it happens so little that I never even noticed. It feels like such wasted potential. I'd love encounters where Horriblins swipe at you from the ceiling while Bokoblins run around you. I feel like it would be really hectic and would actually force players to strategize. Or an encounter with Bokoblins where a Like-Like spits rocks or fire at you, a danger that you would either have to take out first or avoid. Even the original Legend of Zelda does this, and it makes trying to deal with other enemies in the room absolutely terrifying. Even though there are more enemies in Tears of the Kingdom, it's still not a lot, and the best thing to do with so few enemies is to mix them up in unique ways to keep fights interesting. But that unfortunately doesn't happen, with one exception. I'd also like to point out that since Horriblins and Like-Likes are always in caves, that means that while you're exploring the overworld, you will still be fighting the same cans of Bokoblins, Moblins, and Lizalfos, with maybe an occasional boss Bokoblin thrown in. What's even worse is that these camps can be found in the depths as well. You will almost never get away from them. The only part of the map without these enemies is the sky, which has constructs instead. These constructs remind me a lot of the little Sheikah robots in Breath of the Wild, and they even have a pretty similar moveset as well. But what they might lack in unique moveset capabilities is made up for by their ability to use Zonai devices, which includes things like freeze rods, lasers, and even cannons. These constructs are the exception I mentioned earlier. Because parts of the Sky Islands are falling down, so too are the constructs, and groups of them can occasionally be found fighting Bokoblins. It's a page that almost seems to be taken from Elden Ring, but it goes miles in making the world feel authentic and believable. Bokoblins are made from Ganon, and constructs were made by the Zonai, so it makes sense that the two wouldn't get along. It's really satisfying to either jump into the fray, or to wait out the battle to see who wins so that you can pick off the stragglers. Or if you have a vehicle, you might just be able to massacre all of them. I've always enjoyed this kind of thing in Dark Souls, and it leads to some interesting co-op moments between you and your enemy, sometimes working together to defeat a greater enemy, and then promptly killing them afterwards once they aggro on you. That being said, another lacking aspect of Breath of the Wild was the mini-boss variety, so let's move on to that next. In Breath of the Wild, there were 4 mini-bosses: Stone Taluses, Hinoxes, Molduga, and Lynels. The first two appear too often for how simple and repetitive they become, and the Molduga is entirely exclusive to the desert, which would be fine if there were more regionally exclusive bosses, but there aren't. So that leaves us with the Lynels. It's no great surprise that Lynels are extremely enjoyable to fight, and it's the reason why to this day you can still find videos of people doing over-the-top tricks to kill them. This favoritism amongst players also extends to the Guardians, whose early game threat, design, and music makes them stand out despite really only having one attack. These two enemies were naturally successful. In Tears of the Kingdom, I think Nintendo tried to replicate that success with two new mini-bosses, the Gleeoks and the Gloomhands. This might have been a good idea considering how much fun tough enemies like Lynels are to fight, but I don't think these new ones end up as engaging. Let's start with Gleeoks, which I think are meant to imitate the Lynels because of their presentation and high damage. First off, I just want to say how much I appreciate them using this enemy type. As a fan of the Zelda series, it's really cool to see an enemy that was only ever in 2D Zeldas finally appear in a 3D game, and I think the design in Tears of the Kingdom is genuinely great. It's not only intimidating from up close, but from afar as well, and some of them even fly around, which is pretty cool. But beyond their presentation, I didn't really get much out of them. I'm tempted to criticize them, but at the same time, I never really bothered to fight them in the first place, because they had so much health. I would try to fight one, then give up and reload when I realized that I would have to waste not only all of my weapons, but a lot of arrows as well to actually beat them. I ended up only beating one in the entire game, and it was one of the king variants that can be found in the depths. After I did beat it, it dropped items that were literally worse than items I got from Lynels, even though the fight felt a lot harder. The fight itself just kind of felt boring and cheap. I didn't like hiding from it the entire time, nor did I enjoy being pelted by 100 projectiles when I did try to engage with it, and the only satisfaction I got from the fight was when I finally killed it. Then there's the Gloomhands, which I can and will criticize because of how much they genuinely annoyed me. Their presentation is absolutely trying to mimic the Guardians. It's supposed to be a scary encounter, and while it might have been unnerving at first, it became incessantly infuriating every time it showed up. I don't know if I missed something, but I genuinely do not know how you're supposed to fight these things. I say that because I'm pretty sure the way I fought them was not the intended way. Every time I tried to attack them with a weapon, they would just pick Link up, and even if I could kill one, more would respawn before I could kill them all. So eventually I would just use any bow with a multiplier and attach bombs to it, shoot it in the center of the hands a couple of times, and that would be the fight. Or it would be if Phantom Ganon didn't appear afterwards, but his moveset is so simple that fighting him is hardly even a challenge. At least parrying Guardians or cutting their limbs off was satisfying, but bow spamming bombs isn't, and neither is fighting a mini-boss with 3 moves. Unfortunately, my attitude towards the other 2 bosses aren't so good either. Remember that monster that killed me in the depths? That thing is called a Phrox, and there are a few variants of it that are essentially the same. But just like the Gleeoks, I only fought these things once, ever. It only took me one fight to realize how worthless that fight actually was. And again, while the presentation was good, the mechanics were subpar, exasperated by the fact that they've already been used before. You let it eat a bomb so it gets stunned, climb on its back to break some rocks, get tossed off, rinse and repeat. The items I got from killing it were okay, but the fight was so uninteresting that I never felt like I should fight one again. I would always just run past. On the other hand, there's the Flux constructs, which have really good mechanics, but those mechanics are dulled through repetition. For a while I enjoyed fighting them. Despite their size, they're surprisingly maneuverable, and the way they shift shape makes each phase of the fight unique. The problem though is that there's just too many of them, and after a certain point I stopped caring to fight them. They're all over the Sky Islands, they're in the depths, they're even required to fight to open a few shrines. This would have been cool if they had done it once, but the moment you see another like it, it instantly loses its luster. I feel like I keep finding myself saying that a boss was cool, or would have been cool, but because these fights are everywhere, they become much less interesting. This is the exact same problem Breath of the Wild has, showing that the core design of these bosses has not changed between the 2 games. In fact, I'd say that this design philosophy exists across every single Zelda game. A lot of bosses in Zelda games are really pretty simple, but that's more acceptable when you will only ever fight that boss once across an entire playthrough. You'll learn the mechanics, beat it, and then if you play the game again, you can look forward to that unique encounter. The exception to this is Majora's Mask and Skyward Sword. In Majora's Mask, you'll have to fight Goat at least one more time if you want the Razor Sword, and even more if you mess the quest up or don't have the Zora Mask yet, which you won't until you get Epona and go to the next area. Goat is an amazing boss the first time you fight him, but unsurprisingly that fight becomes a slog every time you have to do it again. In Skyward Sword, you'll have to fight the Imprisoned 3 times, and while it changes slightly each time, it lessens the overall experience to have to fight him more than once. To have this same design philosophy work in a completely open world, there has to be significantly less of the same boss, and more unique bosses for each region. This would help make the bosses less repetitive and more special. I want to emphasize that I wouldn't be so critical of Tears of the Kingdom's mini-bosses and so many other things if Breath of the Wild hadn't already made the same mistakes beforehand. As a sequel to that game, Tears of the Kingdom should be an improvement on that original experience, not to continuously expand on every mistake that it has to offer. Speaking of expanding on mistakes, I actually quite enjoyed the shrines in Breath of the Wild. I think they served as a great way to give players different things to do rather than just constant exploration, and it was a system that helped continuously feed players more of the classic Zelda puzzles while still in a completely open world. That being said, however, I do recognize how flawed they can really be. The puzzles in these shrines are often not all that good, mostly because they are too small to really expand on any ideas that they introduce. These shrines can also be accessed in any order, meaning that there is no structure or progression between shrines either. They're all self-contained puzzles that mostly have nothing to do with one another. This is a far cry from the way Nintendo designs their games, a design philosophy which they themselves have pioneered, where an idea is first introduced and then is continuously expanded upon as the level goes on. Imagine if you were playing Mario, and at the start of a level you were introduced to a rotating platform in a safe environment. You make it across said platform, but then the level just ends. That might sound extreme, but that literally happens in Breath of the Wild. There are shrines with only a single simple puzzle, and then it's just over. So it seems like the best solution would be to either make the shrines bigger, which a few of them already are, or to keep the shrines small but have them build upon one another. I prefer the former to the latter, because as an open world game it would be hard to create a progression system for shrines when they can be found in any order, though this problem could already have a solution. Since each shrine loads you into a different area, perhaps it could just load you into the same set of predetermined puzzles every time, regardless of location, although this lacks the freedom of allowing a player to choose one shrine over another. Either way, a solution would need to be made for them to be properly engaging. What's funny is that this solution is already partially in the game. Like I said before, there are a few larger shrines that are actually quite good. A lot of people point out this one near Death Mountain specifically. If Nintendo could cut back on the overall number of shrines, but make each one larger, then these shrines could have the potential to be really good. But the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom are exactly the same. And now there's even more of them. Once again, most shrines are fairly short, and there is no progression system to be found. I don't know if I would say these shrines are worse than the ones found in Breath of the Wild, but they certainly aren't better, and there is so little change from the first game that I found myself getting progressively more and more tired of them as the game went on. These traditional puzzle shrines are definitely one of the less interesting types in the game, and the shrines where you have to do a puzzle on the outside via shrine quest are often a lot better. This includes transporting those green rocks that I talked about earlier, diving through a ring of lights, or tracking down a shrine's location with low visibility. Because these shrines require some kind of puzzle to access them, there are usually no puzzles inside. However, for whatever reason, this isn't always the case. Let's take this shrine puzzle here, for instance. First, you get a riddle from this guy on top of Lenore Mountain, and then you use the nearby tower to reach a sky island so that you can snowboard off of it and down the mountain through rings of light. This reveals the shrine, but when you enter it, you still have to do a puzzle. Conversely, there are many freebie shrines where all you have to do is float over to a sky island. That's it. Why should an easier task give you a free shrine? And what makes this worse is that the shrines where you have to deliver a stone to access them are just as easy to get to as well. So some sky shrines make you work for them, while others require you to do literally nothing at all. Would you know it, this same inconsistency exists in Breath of the Wild as well, but now it seems like it's even more prevalent. There's 32 more shrines in Tears of the Kingdom, but I'd say that at least that many don't even have a puzzle in them. It almost feels like the developers ran out of ideas, but still wanted the player to be able to get a ludicrous 40 hearts, though you would never ever need that many. The only shrines that actually improve on Breath of the Wilds are the combat shrines. All 21 combat shrines in Breath of the Wild were exactly the same. You fight a miniature guardian in the exact same room, its moveset never changes, and the only thing that's different is the amount of damage and health it has. They're repetitive in the same way that many of the mini-bosses become repetitive. There's just way too many of them. Thankfully, Tears of the Kingdom removes these shrines and replaces them with combat shrines with enemy encounters instead, a change that works better in nearly every way. You're stripped of your weapons just like on Eventide or in the Trials, and you're given a set of weapons at the start, meaning that every shrine is tailored to exactly what it gives you. This also means you won't be wasting your hard-earned weapons on enemies you might have previously skipped. The layouts are always different, and oftentimes there's a different mechanic to be utilized in each of them. One of them is dark with lights you can pick up, another one has little robots you can make to attack your enemies, and one lets you build your own vehicles to run down enemies with, a shrine that ended up being my favorite in the entire game. I liked it so much that I actually did it twice, just so I could assemble the big vehicle in the center. It's frustrating how few things are actually better in Tears of the Kingdom than Breath of the Wild, and the few times where improvements are made just go to show that Nintendo is entirely capable of making a better game. But for every step forward, they also seem to take a step back, because now there are annoying tutorial shrines in the game as well. These are all really boring, and are just about as fun as playing through a blatant tutorial can be. These also make no sense because there's no reason that the actual tutorial area couldn't have taught you this information instead. It would also make sure that everybody sees that information rather than just scattering it around the map. One of these shrines even teaches you a mechanic that is exclusive to Tears of the Kingdom, and I have no idea why you aren't given this information at the start of the game. It only strengthens my suspicion that the developers ran out of ideas for shrines, like they just took tutorials from the Great Sky Island and slapped them into shrines instead. I really hope that wasn't the case. Oh boy. This here was my single most anticipated aspect of Tears of the Kingdom. Despite having the word Zelda in the title, Breath of the Wild's dungeons did not live up to that standard. They were all far too similar, repetitive, and simple to even come close to what had come before. These dungeons had so much room to improve, and I was genuinely looking forward to seeing what they would do in the next game. But before we get into that, let's talk about what I think makes a good Zelda dungeon first. Let's use the Snow Peak Ruins from Twilight Princess as an example. From the very beginning, this dungeon sets itself apart as unique, not only in a storytelling perspective, but in a visual sense as well. To get to this dungeon, you first have to track down the supposed man-beast that has been frequenting Zora's domain, a trail that when followed will lead you up a frigid mountain into its summit. At its top, you eventually find the man-beast, only for him to turn out to be a friendly yeti who has been catching fish for his ill wife. He invites you to his home on the mountain, which you then reach by following him sledding down the mountain's treacherous slopes. His home actually ends up being the dungeon, as it's a giant snowy mansion that houses a shard of the Mirror of Twilight. It's a completely unique theme that has never been done before in the entire series. Most think of dungeons as an underground temple or cavern, so this wooden mansion instantly sets itself apart. Upon entering, you are greeted by this piece of ambient music. It's a memorable track that serves as a backdrop to the player's exploration, and it reflects the area you're in. It even has a second, more warm variant for when you're in the kitchen with the Yeti while he makes soup, or by the fire with his wife. The mansion itself is made up of 3 sections: a courtyard, the first floor, and the second floor. The objective of the dungeon is to find the key that will lead into the bedroom on the upper floor where the Mirror of Twilight is being held. However, that key is in an inaccessible room. There's a ladder leading up to that room, but it's being guarded by an ice monster that will knock you off before you reach the top. Another one of these ice monsters is in the bottom of the courtyard, and it can be killed by firing a cannonball at it. This allows you access to the ball and chain, the dungeon's main item. You can throw it at the monster above the ladder, but it doesn't quite reach. However, there is a cannon on the second floor that can shoot the ice monster above the ladder. Using the ball and chain, you can access the second floor, which leads in a giant circle around the house and connects to the first floor in interesting ways. There's an ice block puzzle early on that you have to solve to open a door on the first floor, and that same puzzle can be solved in a different way later on to open a door on the second floor. There's also these swinging platforms that hang above rooms you previously explored. Eventually you'll reach the cannon that you saw earlier, but you'll still need a cannonball before you can shoot it, so you have to make an entrance in the previous room so that it connects back to the ramp that leads to the first floor. Then you can go back down to the first floor, pick up a cannonball from outside, carry it up to the second floor, shoot it across the room through the hole in the wall, and then you can take it outside to the cannon. You use it to kill the ice monster, and only then can you access the room with the key to the bedchamber. This dungeon utilizes several concepts that are consistently expanded upon, and are laid out over the course of an interconnected area, one that not only challenges your puzzle-solving skills, but your perception of that space as well. The icing on top of that cake, then, is a great boss fight which involves the now possessed Yeti's wife. The music is exceptional, and the mechanics are great, utilizing what you have already learned in the dungeon beforehand to make for an engaging and memorable encounter. After the fight, you save the Yeti's wife from the Mirror of Twilight, and she is reunited with her husband in a silly but heartwarming way. Snow Peak Ruins is an undeniably great Zelda dungeon, and it's for these reasons and more that it's considered a favorite among many fans. Out of everything, that's the thing that I most want you to take away from this: how a good Zelda dungeon should be made. And if you're unfamiliar with previous Zelda games, I hope this gives some perspective on not only Breath of the Wild's dungeons, but on Tears of the Kingdom's as well, or at least some perspective on where I'm coming from in this review. That being said, let's discuss Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons. There's only 5, so I'll talk about all of them. The first dungeon I did in Tears of the Kingdom was the Wind Temple. Just like in Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom heavily steers you towards this dungeon. Impa is already in that direction beforehand, and NPCs constantly remind you of what's going on in that region. I didn't feel like being rebellious, so I decided to just do it first like the game wanted. The Wind Temple is connected to the Rito village much like Va Mado beforehand, and as such you are required to help the Rito first before you can get in. Rito village is snowed in, and you are required to find Teba's son, Tolan. After you do, you're tasked with exploring the nearby storm in the sky. This storm hides the Wind Temple inside of it, a huge boat-shaped dungeon, which I think is a really unique and interesting external design for a dungeon, though the brown bricks on the inside aren't really pleasant to look at. To get up to it, you have to utilize the new ability that Tolan provides the player with, as well as these trampoline boats that you can jump on to gain height. These trampoline boats are a really fun mechanic, and the part where you have to ascend a group of them as they circle around the storm was extremely enjoyable. It required a good use of Tolan's ability, and your own ability to land on moving targets. Afterwards, you finally land in the Wind Temple, which on my playthrough was my final moment of truth. This is where the game would reveal to me whether or not it had taken the necessary steps to improve the dungeons. I walked around, and
there are still 5 locks securing the hatch on the deck. Use your power to release all 5 locks, and the hatch should open. Heed my words.
This dungeon is the exact same as the ones in Breath of the Wild. You go around solving singular puzzles in disjointed rooms to open a lock in the center. It's a desperate attempt to give the illusion that these disparate ideas are somehow related to a whole, but it does not work. It would be the exact same if they had just put 5 shrines in a room that you had to solve to open a door and went, yep, that's a dungeon. Except you cannot apply shrine design to a dungeon. Dungeons are not meant to be bite-sized puzzles. They are meant to be an expansive, unified whole that has some underlying theme or concept, not 5 rooms with 5 different puzzles. There's no progression there, and without some kind of progression, you literally cannot make a challenge interesting. At least the boss at the end was thankfully much more unique, and not just another variant of Ganon like in Breath of the Wild. However, the fight isn't much to write home about either. You fly around the boss and shoot its weak points until it dies. It shoots some tornadoes, but they're extremely easy to avoid. The design is cool, but at this point I'm tired of even saying that, because the compliment only goes so far. I don't think the music for this boss is particularly great either. The only memorable part in it is when it utilizes the Rito Village theme, a song that was not only in Breath of the Wild, but even back in Wind Waker as well. While the Blazida theme has elements of the main theme in it, those themes aren't the crux of the entire song. They're a subtle addition that make it more impactful. There are more memorable parts to it than just the main theme. Afterwards, you get a generic cutscene and are done with the dungeon. Not a great first impression, and at that point, I already knew what was in store. The next dungeon I did was the Fire Temple. This one is obviously in Death Mountain, and to get to it you first have to help the Gorons. You speak to Bluto, who then directs you to find Yunobo, who has been influenced by the evil power of Ganon. To save him, you first have to fight him, and while I wish I could tell you what happens in this fight, I can't because it was so unremarkable and easy that I don't even remember what the mechanics were. Afterwards, you use his power to get to the top of Death Mountain, where you fight another boss, Moregia. There's a glider nearby that you can use to fight it, which would make for an amazingly cool boss fight if it lasted for more than 30 seconds. Seriously, you destroy its 3 heads and that's it. It's so fun while you're doing it, but it's so short that it feels like the game is ripping the enjoyment away from you. If there would have been 2 more phases, the fight could have been amazing. A cavern to the depths is revealed inside Death Mountain afterwards, and jumping down it reveals probably the most visually interesting area in the entirety of the depths. I love the look of the lava from Death Mountain pooling down into the caverns below, and the giant temple in the distance looks visually stunning. It's too bad that it only looks good from a distance, because once inside you are surrounded by the same dull, ugly bricks. It's also a shame that the dungeon is full of the same boring puzzles as the Wind Temple, and while the dungeon tries to stay interconnected via minecart rails, it is exceedingly easy to break with Ascend. You can just skip to the top and then glide over to the different puzzles, completely negating the use of these rails. The objective is to once again open a series of locks to open a door, where you can then fight the boss. The boss of the Fire Temple is the Marbled Goma, an enemy which has been a boss in numerous Zelda games beforehand. The way to defeat it is already immediately obvious, though the way you break its legs off using Yunobo's ability is unique. It'll shoot projectiles at you while you do this, or climb onto the ceiling, which you can counteract by shooting Yunobo up the walls and across the roof. This makes the fight feel a lot more like a conventional Zelda boss, as you have to actually utilize Yunobo's ability to damage it. It's not my favorite boss in the game, but it's definitely better than Colgera. Afterwards, you get the same cutscene again, and the dungeon's over. Moving on. The third dungeon I visited was the Water Temple. It's located above Zora's domain, and to get to it you need to help the Zoras first. After talking to Sidon's fiancé, you find him atop Ploymus Mountain, to which he points you to a ruin site nearby where you can find a riddle. This riddle then needs to be taken to King Dorfian to be deciphered, who himself is hidden behind a waterfall. I think this part has a lot of potential, but it's a bit too simple. The riddle you find in the ruins is literally only a few feet away from where it fell off the wall, and the way to King Dorfian is being blatantly kept secret by these kids. Maybe if you had to go all around Zora's domain to get info, it would be better, and the fact that some kids know the answer would make it all the more surprising. Regardless, you solve the riddle using King Dorfian's fins, which then opens a whirlpool in the lake. But before you can get there, you have to fight a boss with Sidon, the Sludge-like. This boss is pretty pathetic, and it kind of only serves as a tutorial for the boss of the dungeon, and on how to get rid of the falling sludge. It can't do much to attack you, and you only have to hit it with water once to be able to damage it. I think its attacks are meant to change how you approach it, but at the point of the game I was in, I was easily able to barrel through all of it, because I'm pretty sure the bosses don't scale in this game, just like in Breath of the Wild, but maybe I'm wrong. Back to the whirlpool in the lake, after the boss you can jump into it, which will take you to a cave under the lake. I was really excited when I first saw this, because I thought it might actually be the dungeon. An underground cave dungeon like the Water Temple in Twilight Princess sounded really cool, especially after the other 2 dungeons were made of brick. I even started thinking about interesting ways a dungeon like this might let you explore the bottom of the lake. But that didn't happen, and instead, this cave is mostly just one big room that only serves to open a path to the dungeon. Which is a shame because the actual Water Temple is visually terrible. And I'm not kidding when I say it's probably the worst looking dungeon in the entire series. Not only is it made from the same bricks as the other 2 dungeons, it's split up into floating platforms which make it look like every other floating island in the game. Aside from the fountain in the center, there is literally nothing to distinguish this dungeon's looks from afar. That's also why I thought the cave under the lake might be the dungeon, because I genuinely did not think that the Sky Islands above Zora's domain looked anything like a dungeon. There's not even a concrete shape, and it's so small that it looks completely insignificant. But even more appalling are the puzzles inside, which are so simple and easy that I am baffled someone thought it was a good idea to put them in a main dungeon. This one here requires you to build a water wheel to power an electricity line, a mechanic that I had already seen in a shrine beforehand. Then you put a bubble between a gap in the line, and that's it. That's all it takes to complete a major part of the dungeon. Even worse is the puzzle right next to it. All you have to do is jump into the air and shoot a switch, and that opens a lock. This is not a puzzle. This is a task. All you have to do is take one look at it and you'll know the solution. There's nothing to be solved and there's nothing to figure out. It's so bad that it only took me around 20 minutes to complete the entirety of this dungeon. I have played Twilight Princess many times, and even knowing the solution to all of the puzzles, it will still take me around 40 minutes to an hour to complete a dungeon like Snow Peak Ruins. Fortunately, the boss fares a bit better than the rest of the dungeon. Its design is actually something I wish the Zelda series would do more often. So many bosses are larger than the player, so seeing a little boss is a breath of fresh air. Its mechanics are fine, it's covered in sludge so all you have to do is shoot it with water to stun it, but later on it'll jump away from you if there's still sludge left around it. I think this boss would probably work a lot better if you could only use Sidon to fight it. That way you would have to utilize your water smartly to clear obstructions and stun the boss. By bringing in an entire arsenal, the fight is significantly trivialized when you can just equip a ×3 bow and spam water everywhere. After you beat it, you are treated to the same cutscene again, and the dungeon's over. And I can't fully express just how much I despised it. For the final of the 4 regional dungeons I did, we have the Lightning Temple. It's located in the Gerudo Desert, and requires you to help the Gerudo people before you can access it. I hope this isn't getting old for you, by the way. Once you arrive in Gerudo Town, you find that it's covered in sand and overrun with Gibdo, and that the town's residents have moved to a bunker underground. You meet with Valeria, who tells you where to find Riju, and once you meet up with her, you combine your powers to help defend the Bazaar from Gibdos. After that, you clear out Gerudo Town. I like how combat-oriented this quest is, and I also like how you can choose where to place your defenses and soldiers when defending Gerudo Town, although it doesn't really matter much because it's not all that hard. Even though I was supposed to be fighting off hordes of Gibdos, never once did they gain the upper hand. Not more than 1 or 2 even made it inside. Usually in defense games, a group or 2 find a way in and amp up the tension, but that never happened here. Afterwards, you get a riddle on how to find the Lightning Temple, which involves reflecting a beam of light in a large triangle, which after solving causes the temple to appear. Before you enter, the boss of the dungeon attempts to assault you, but runs off after it loses half health. This temple actually almost tricked me into thinking that it would be different from the others. Even though it was still made of the same ugly bricks, there wasn't a lock puzzle in sight. That hope was quickly slapped away from me, however, when I found yet another open area with 4 locks to open. Despite that, the Lightning Temple was easily my favorite dungeon in the game, though that sentence should be taken with more than a few grains of salt. It's full of light-reflecting puzzles, and amazingly, a few actually extend across more than a single room. To access one of the locks, you first have to glide your way over to this room that has 2 spinning half circles. By using Rewind, you can line these circles up so that light can get through them, which powers a mirror on the other side of the main chamber that opens another room. Going through this room, you stop a few smashing walls to open a path, and then position a light to face down that path so that when you solve a puzzle below it, it reflects the light you just created onto a mirror that opens a lock. Wow, it's almost shocking to find a puzzle in this game that takes more than a minute. However, I'd also like to point out that Ocarina of Time was able to accomplish these exact same types of puzzles, a game that came out over 25 years ago. And that puzzle was just one of 4. There are still others that are completely isolated to one room, and one is basically just given to you. The boss, Queen Gibdo, is also one of the better in the game. She's fairly mobile despite her size, and has a couple of moves, including a charge attack, projectiles, and tornadoes that can prevent Riju from using her lightning ability. At half health, she spawns Gibdos to make the fight more chaotic, but you can take them out by destroying their nests. I'd say this boss is probably the best of all the regional dungeons, and it's at least more challenging than the others. Surprisingly, you get to watch the same cutscene again for the 4th time, and that's the dungeon. Before I move on to the 5th and final dungeon, I want to explain something. If some of you were bored by me explaining the quests leading up to every dungeon, then that was the intended effect, because I wanted to emphasize just how similar each of them are. It's not so much that the activities are similar, but rather everything that's in between. Someone tells you where to find a character, you find that character, hear a voice, fight a boss or group of enemies, make your way towards a dungeon, hear a voice again, see Zelda doing something weird somewhere along the way, complete the dungeon using that character's abilities, and then they give you their sage ability. These events always feel the same, and even though the activities they lead towards often aren't, it ends up making them all feel incredibly samey. Breath of the Wild tends to have this issue as well, but I think it's even worse in Tears of the Kingdom, in most part due to these 3 events that happen the exact same way every time. The one exception to this is the 5th dungeon, the Spirit Temple. This dungeon can be done at any point in the game provided you have 9 hearts, but can be found in the depths even earlier than that, though you can't access it yet. I kinda wish you could though, because I found the Spirit Temple really early on, but because I didn't start at the right point, I couldn't do it until way later when I happened to stumble across the right way in. Still, I really like the idea of a dungeon being hidden somewhere in the world, and it's left up to the player to find it while exploring. As I mentioned before, you need 9 hearts to access this dungeon, as it's locked behind a door that drains your health as you open it. Behind the door is a mask, which you have to fly down to a statue in the valley below to unlock a giant elevator. This elevator leads down to the Spirit Temple, and once you put the mask into a mold, the dungeon begins. The objective of this dungeon is to collect several robot parts to put together to form a full robot, each of which are hidden behind a short series of puzzles. Despite being a different objective, this is still functionally the same as all the other dungeons. You do several puzzles to open a path forward. I will admit that gathering parts to put together your own kind of mech is a really neat idea. However, it's one that's completely butchered by how thoughtless the puzzles ended up being. I genuinely don't know if I did any of these puzzles right, because they're so easy to break. I think for this lava one, you're supposed to find some way to make a bridge across the lava, but if you have enough stamina, you can literally just climb across the wall to the other side. There's this one where you're meant to glide one of the parts along the rail, but if you just stand on the rail with the part below you, you can literally just lift it over the wall without doing the puzzle. And finally, there's a puzzle that involves a long electrified walkway over a pit, but using one of my build blueprints that I found, I just built a series of platforms that allowed me to lift the robot part over to the other side, completely bypassing the puzzle. These are not the intended way to do these puzzles, and it feels like there was no quality control put into them whatsoever before they were dropped into the game. Apparently the developers spent a year polishing the game before they released it, but with puzzles like this in the game, I find that really hard to believe. As it stands, it's a half-baked dungeon that seems to reflect the half-baked nature of the area it's located in. After you get all the robot parts, you can finally assemble Minoru, the game's 5th sage. Afterwards, you leave behind the main part of the dungeon and tromp through the depths on your newly acquired mech, blowing up enemies and obstructions along the way. While not very puzzly, this part of the dungeon was still pretty fun, and the Hinox placed deliberately in the way makes for a really satisfying takedown. Even more satisfying is when you reach the boss of this dungeon, the Seized Construct. Riding atop Minoru, this fight is staged like a boxing match between you and the boss, and to damage it, you have to punch it into the electrified fence that surrounds the arena. Just like your own mech, it can even pick up Zonai devices and use them against you, which you will often utilize to fly around the arena and shoot cannons at you. This is by far the best boss in the game, one that is not only extremely fun, but also completely unique to the series. I had a blast fighting it. It's such a shame then, that this boss is shamelessly reused for the Master Koga fight. In fact, every single dungeon boss has several duplicates in the depths. I feel like I'm experiencing Elden Ring all over again. Why? Why would they do this? All it does is make these bosses feel less important. These are supposed to be the creatures causing all of the problems in Hyrule, causing snowstorms, making hypnotic rock roasts, polluting the water supply, and even emptying an entire town. And yet, there's at least 2 of each of them just sitting in the depths, doing nothing. Imagine if there was another Blizzetta. It wouldn't make any sense. And it doesn't. Not in context of the story or the gameplay. Not even Breath of the Wild did this. Why does this game somehow have even worse dungeons? At least the dungeons in Breath of the Wild had an interesting concept, and you could change the layout of each of them in interesting ways. The dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom have nothing like that to hold them together. They're just shallow brick rooms full of boring puzzles. Why is the sequel to the best-selling game in the entire series worse? As a sequel, there should be an obligation to improve on the shortcomings of what came before. It should do something new and innovative to differentiate itself from that original experience. Because if you don't, then what's the point? A sequel should not exist to just be more of the same thing. This is why so many people have grown tired of 2D Marios. There's new games, but the series has remained static for many, many years. It's for this exact reason that I don't care much for Mario Galaxy 2. It tries to be more of Mario Galaxy, but without the heart and soul of what made that first game so great. Portal 1 is not the same game as Portal 2. There's a complete difference in atmosphere and tone, one that makes each game stand apart from one another. Portal 1 is a game about subtle storytelling, and Portal 2 is a game with extremely clever writing. Each game stands on its own as its own individual experience. If Valve had tried to copy what made the first Portal game so successful, it would have made for a bland repeat. Empire Strikes Back is not the same as A New Hope. They don't just blow up another Death Star, because that would be fucking boring. Majora's Mask is not the same game as Ocarina of Time. Despite having a lot of the same textures and character models, both games offer a different experience. The list goes on. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are 2 sides of the same coin. Sure, they might have some different mechanics, dungeons, and locations, but at the end of the day, it's still the same coin. If you play Tears of the Kingdom first, then you'll be bored by how much less there is in Breath of the Wild. And if you play Breath of the Wild first, then you'll be bored playing through the same world again. This is why I think Tears of the Kingdom is a copy of Success. It sees the success of its predecessor and only aims to replicate that same success to try and gain even more. Before we move forward, I'd like to preface that this game's story has many of the same problems as Breath of the Wild. It's a never-changing constant in Tears of the Kingdom, and with that in mind, from here on out, I will be keeping my comparisons to Breath of the Wild to a minimum. Funnily enough, I think Tears of the Kingdom's story was better before the game was even released. You might be asking how that's even possible, but if I point you towards the game's first teaser trailer back in 2019, you might see what I mean. This trailer was framed perfectly. It set up an amazing level of excitement and mystery around what I was seeing. The music was unsettling, the visuals were creepy, and the way it was all edited together left me begging for more. Afterwards, there were even clickbaity articles of the game supposedly going to be darker than Majora's Mask, with Eiji Aonuma himself even comparing the new game to the 2000s release. In retrospect, it's kind of funny to think about, because after playing Tears of the Kingdom, I can confirm that its story is not even close to being as dark and surreal as that game is. Because of the circumstances that it was developed under, Majora's Mask reeked of fear and impending doom, set under the constant pressure of a timer ticking down to your inevitable death. Every day that passes, your life and the lives of others are slowly slipping away, and the only way of preventing this is by running away from that inevitability, over and over, desperately grasping for more time. But there's more to Majora's Mask than just being dark or creepy. It's got a lot of really emotionally charged and beautiful moments. You heal the dead spirit of a Goron hero so that he can finally rest, rescue a child's zombified father, reunite Anju and Kafei so that their final moments can be spent together. When you go to the moon, every thought of what it might look like could never prepare you for what it actually is. Majora's Mask is a game full of subtlety and nuance, but that same statement cannot be applied to Tears of the Kingdom story. It's basic and clear-cut, and in many ways it feels like a repeat of Breath of the Wild story. Link gets beaten by Ganon, Zelda sacrifices herself to help stop him, his influence starts to come back, Link uses newfound powers to gain strength, helps the 4 regions, finally defeats Ganon, and saves the princess. There's even a spirit from an age past to help guide you through the tutorial. It's a story that feels done again and again, and what new things it has to offer leave a lot to be desired. But rather than discuss the overall story, I'd like to talk about the pitfalls along the way. Let's start with her. Purah goes to show that a character doesn't have to be interesting or have an engaging arc for people to like them. They just have to be attractive. I don't know about you, but I don't find static characters to be very interesting. And no, 3 journals don't count as character development. I honestly found Purah to be a lot more enjoyable in the first game. She's a genius adult stuck in a child's body, and that's something interesting. While her character might come off as overbearing to some, I always enjoyed her personality, though the Purah in Tears of the Kingdom will still regurgitate the same catchphrases as before.
Check it!
When you first meet with her, there's also this really obnoxious cutscene where she just recounts everything that has happened in the game so far, as if the game is tuning the player like they're so brain dead that they don't even remember what happened 2 hours ago. There's no point in recounting information that the player already knows, because it's patronizing and boring. It's why in other Zelda games, when you tell a character something that has happened, it just does this. But no, let's just do this instead.
So when you and Princess Zelda go beneath Hyrule Castle, you discover a mysterious mummy which suddenly reanimates. Then Zelda falls into a fissure and vanishes. That must have been when the castle rose and the ruins fell. Then, later, you wake up on a sky island, saved by the arm that was stuck to the mummy. You get the Purah pad from an unusual creature, and learn that your new arm belonged to someone named Rauru. The Master Sword disappears. You hear the princess's voice, and find your way here.
Wow, didn't that feel necessary? Maybe I should play the intro of this video again so that you don't forget what I'm talking about. I love Breath of the Wild. Purah mainly serves as a guidepost for players, giving them directions to important things around the world. One of which is the geoglyphs. There are 11 of these geoglyphs around Hyrule, and they work the same as the Princess's Compendium in the first game. You go to one of their locations to find a memory so that you can view it to learn more about the story. I hated this approach to the story in Breath of the Wild, and I hate it even more in Tears of the Kingdom, as it's a system that makes it nearly impossible for me to stay engaged with the story. It just doesn't work, and I have several reasons why. Firstly, the stories these memories tell has already happened, and as such, my actions as the player have zero effect on what happens. The player not being present in a story makes a huge difference in engagement, because if I'm not there to actually see what happens in the moment, then why should I care? If Mother 3 started at Chapter 4, then Hanawa's death would be meaningless. You would hear about it, and it would have an effect on other characters, but as the player, it wouldn't mean anything if you hadn't been there. It would also make it really hard for you to relate with Lucas and Flint. The memories in Tears of the Kingdom are also set in the distant past, which means you will likely know exactly what happens before you see it. Since you already see Rauru as a spirit, it's easy to assume that he's going to die. You could argue that finding out how he died could be interesting as a mystery, but if you just do a dungeon beforehand, then the answer is blatantly given to you. He sacrifices himself to stop Ganon. So if I already know what happened, and how it happened, then again, why should I care? I think the story only gets away with one of these mysteries, but I'll still get more into why I still don't like the execution of that specific event in a bit. Another problem with these memories is that they are too short for you to be able to get invested. I think the greatest example of this is Queen Sonia's death. She only has 11 minutes of screen time before she dies, which is nowhere near enough time to make me care about a character before they die. Either that or the character has to be really well written, which Queen Sonia isn't. She's just a nice queen lady who becomes somewhat of a mentor to Zelda. And then she dies. That's not even much of a character to begin with. And Rauru is the exact same way. He's a noble king. That's his entire character. So when he sacrifices himself to stop Ganon, again, I don't care. Zelda is the only one I slightly cared about, but that's mostly because she has an entire other game to fall back on. Finally, giving the player the option to view a linear story in any order is really, really dumb. Yes, there's an option to know what order the memories go in, but if you're like me, you might not have even realized that until after you had already seen all of them. I call it a linear story because it's really meant to be seen in a specific order, or at least I think it works best in order. An example of a non-linear story would be something like Outer Wilds, where any information you find is only a tiny piece in a much grander picture. Just because you know the Nomai are extinct absolutely does not mean you know why they went extinct, or even what they were doing, why they were doing that, or why they were even there in the first place. It's so open-ended that the only way to understand the whole thing is to acquire every piece. Even though their stories are split into pieces, I don't think Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom accomplish this on the same level. I don't feel like I'm putting pieces together, I feel like I'm being given a story out of order, which makes it a lot less engaging. Because of this, it's also entirely possible that you might just spoil something ahead of time. I just happened upon the cutscene where Ganon becomes the Demon King while I was exploring, and it was completely out of left field. Not only does this ruin previous cutscenes you might not have seen, it also highlights just how important things like tension and build-up are as well. Whenever something big is about to happen, there's also some kind of build-up to that. Before the final boss, there's a level that you have to do beforehand. Not just an instant cut to whatever's happening. It'd be like if Darth Vader just showed up randomly and told Luke that he was his father, rather than the almost 30-minute build-up of Luke deciding to leave his training, flying to Cloud City, falling into Vader's trap, and then having to duel him. Once again, this is also partly to blame for Link's absence in the story. If you had to physically go to where a story moment was currently happening, it would be a lot better. I honestly wish Link was the one who got to go to the past instead of Zelda, because seeing those events firsthand would have been a lot more impactful. It also would have been a great way to reuse the same world, but in the past instead. There was also a memory I found with a flashback to a previous memory that I hadn't even seen yet, and it was just so bewildering not having context for a scene that the developers clearly wanted you to have context for. Although simple, this story would be so much better if it was happening in a natural order as the game progressed. Just about every problem I brought up here could be solved by just doing that. And I don't want to hear the argument that they can't do that because it's an open world game, because there have been several open world games with linear stories. It's really not that outlandish of an idea. But let's pretend that this way of telling the story does work. Even then, the story itself has a number of technical problems that make it become laughably stupid. The biggest problem to me is how incredibly incompetent Zelda, Sonia, and Rauru are, and it is none more apparent than in the Show of Fealty memory. In this memory, Ganondorf pledges his loyalty to Rauru in the Kingdom of Hyrule, something of an homage to this scene in Ocarina of Time. In that game, however, I was always under the impression that Ganondorf was able to get away with his evil ambitions because he was sneaky and cunning. For the king to completely ignore Zelda's premonitions of Ganondorf, he must have seemed like a very loyal servant. But in Tears of the Kingdom, the entire time he's talking to Rauru, he seems incredibly shady and blatantly suspicious. Zelda even remarks on this afterwards, and then Rauru just goes, "Oh yeah, I know he's evil, but I want to keep him close because it'll be easier to keep an eye on him." What? Why would you do that? If you know he's evil and is plotting against you, then stop him before he does anything. Keeping him around is such a liability, and one that holds disastrous consequences. And you can't just keep an eye on him, because he could strike at any moment. That's the whole point of a plot. But Rauru thinks he's so clever that he just lets Ganondorf off the hook to see what he does next. And unsurprisingly, it costs him not only the life of his wife, but his own life as well. Brilliant. What makes this even worse is that Zelda already knows who Ganondorf is. It's not that hard to put the pieces together. This is the same entity that killed her father, her friends, and destroyed almost the entirety of Hyrule. Not to mention that she had to seal herself away for 100 years just to contain him. Ganondorf isn't just a threat, he is a massive threat, one that could spell doom for not just Hyrule, but for the entire world. She's also seen Ganondorf's mummy in the future with Rauru's hand connected to it. Again, that's a really big red flag. Did she not tell Rauru and Sonia about all this? I don't think she did, because after Sonia dies, then she tells Rauru what she saw, and the specific circumstances of how she got to the past. Why? Why would she wait that long to tell him that? Maybe not at the very beginning, but at least after you see Ganondorf. You are a moron! This stupidity also extends to Sonia as well, who smugly thinks that she and Zelda can outsmart Ganondorf. Even if you think you have the upper hand, you should never put yourself in this situation in the first place. The only way to be truly safe is to stay as far away from anything Ganondorf related as possible. Not to show off how intelligent you think you are. and then she just gets carelessly killed by him, which honestly feels kinda deserved. Since we're on the topic of this scene, I also want to talk about the face Ganondorf makes after killing Sonya. Yeah, it's funny, but it absolutely should not have been used after the death of a major character. It's complete tonal whiplash, and it ends up making Sonya's lackluster death even less impactful. This also changes the focus of the entire scene as well. Whenever people talk about this scene, which is supposed to be the death of Sonya, they aren't talking about that. They're talking about the face Ganondorf makes afterwards. Before anyone gets mad at me, yes, I know that Rauru admits that what happened was his fault. But that only works when it is exclusively his fault, which I don't think it is. Both Zelda and Sonya play a major part in what went wrong, and had they done things more intelligently, Ganondorf would not have been able to rise to power the way he did. This also leads to Zelda's sacrifice, which is meant to be the big reveal in the story. If you didn't already know by now, Zelda consumes her secret stone to become an immortal dragon. She does this to heal the broken Master Sword, as well as to transport it back to Link in the future so that he can defeat Ganondorf when he returns. At first I thought this was really cool, mostly because I was able to figure it out completely on my own before I had even seen any of the memories. In fact, the quest where you have to hunt down the Light Dragon and get the Master Sword ended up being one of my favorite parts of the entire game. Getting the marker for where the Master Sword was and seeing that it was actively moving was really intriguing, an intrigue that then turned to amazement when I realized it was on a dragon. I wasn't in a position to be able to get to the dragon easily, and I had to quickly build a hot air balloon cart so that I could float up to the Light Dragon before it passed me, a spur of the moment idea that ended up having a really satisfying result. I was also happy to see that the Master Sword didn't require hearts to pick up this time, but stamina, which I had already gotten the full wheel for. This whole sequence where you hold onto the dragon to try and pull out the Master Sword was visually amazing, and after the dragon calms down, you get transported to this beautiful area in the clouds, where Link finally pulls out the legendary blade. The silence that accompanies Link as he pulls out the sword is incredibly poignant, and when the classic fanfare finally kicks in, it's accompanied by this gorgeous shot of Link holding the Master Sword aloft with the Light Dragon framed behind him. Even though I've only played this game once, it's easily one of my favorite Master Sword collections in the entire series. Just not having it be in a forest or a temple does seriously so much to make it feel unique. Afterwards, you get a cutscene of Zelda with the Master Sword, which that, and the visual design of the Light Dragon, was enough to cue me in on what had happened. I didn't know how Zelda had turned into the Light Dragon, but I think Ganondorf's transformation into the Demon Dragon by consuming his secret stone during his fight would be just enough to subtly tell me what had happened. That is, it would be if those two events were the only clues you had. Instead, the game repeatedly foreshadows what happened over and over again, before blatantly showing and telling you exactly what happened multiple times, effectively hitting me on the head over and over again with obvious information, like I was incapable of ever figuring it out on my own. I'm willing to accept that this might be a problem exclusive to me, because by figuring out what happened so early on, every time it was brought up again just felt like repeat information. It's the same problem I have with Purah reciting the events of the tutorial right after it happened. I also think that subtly giving the player an answer is a lot more interesting than directly giving the player an answer. It's one of the reasons why I like the story in Dark Souls so much, because you can only begin to start to understand it once you pay attention to everything that's going on. In the case with Zelda being the Light Dragon, I essentially set myself up for it to be a subtle discovery, only for it to end up being the complete opposite. I also had a similar issue with the reveal that the Zelda you see around Hyrule is actually a puppet of Ganon. I hesitate to use the word reveal, because by the time the game tells you the truth, it is already so painstakingly obvious that I'm kind of shocked that they even tried to pass it off as a reveal. Did they seriously expect that when this happened, people would go, "Zelda was Ganon the whole time? What?" As if you haven't already seen her doing extremely suspicious things during the 4 dungeon quests, heard about people seeing her doing suspicious things, obtain the knowledge that Zelda is actually the Light Dragon, and then see it be basically confirmed that Ganon can copy other people's identities in a previous memory. That kind of foreshadowing is about as subtle as a brick to the face. That's about the most I have to say regarding the contents of the story, but there's still a few more gripes that I have with it generally that I haven't brought up yet. I mentioned one of them before when I was talking about the dungeons, but I didn't fully explain it there because I thought it would fit in better with the story part of the video. After you complete a dungeon, you get a cutscene that tells you more about what happened during the imprisoning war. This would be fine if every cutscene had something new to say, but they are all literally just carbon copies of each other, with the only difference between all of them being the sage present. I'm not kidding. These 4 cutscenes are the exact same, even down to the dialogue. Just so you can appreciate how truly terrible this is, I'm going to play all 4 of them at once. That way you can get a better sense of how similar they all are to each other, as well as the horrifying experience I had sitting through all of them. Enjoy!
Sidon, my cherished
little rock, my brave fledgling.
I've heard that voice.
I know that
Are
voice.
you the one who's been talking to us this whole time?
No, you're the one who's been guiding us?
Yes, I am your ancestor.
I am your ancestor from a time long past.
I am your ancestor.
Beloved daughter
of the first king of Hyrule as a mighty
and the sage
and as a
with
sage king like you.
could
I was a
directly
regal
relate
fire and a sage with
You
control.
are the one who's been talking all this time.
your fluid, graceful movements as you fight.
The winds
I would expect you to rest from my time long past.
from my descendant.
I was a Gerudo warrior who served the first king
But
of
it was a servant
Hyrule and the
with great
sage who called down lightning.
But it was a
Just
source
as you
that
can.
blizzard.
I've seen you brandish the
slowly
power of defense of our people.
my
And I would expect nothing less from my
From
descendants.
obtaining the stone.
You are the pride of the Gerudo.
My secret stone.
yes.
The
And
Demon King is responsible for
Secret
sending the
stones.
monster that caused the
Is a lot
sound.
to learn.
so listen closely to what
But the
I say.
monster's true purpose is to prevent you from obtaining the stone.
And the destiny of
My
our
secret
stone.
And the mission our people must accomplish.
Secret stone.
Though we Zora live long
Don't worry.
lives, this all
You will
happened in a
understand.
time
The
ancient
kingdom
and
of
lost.
Hyrule.
The
Let me
kingdom
tell
of
you
Hyrule
the
is
events
still
in our
in its
distant
infancy.
past. The events that shaped our
A
people's
great
destiny.
evil.
The demon
The
king
demon
During the
king
imprisonment.
He invaded Hyrule and sought to cut the new kingdom's time short.
Long,
But
long ago.
The first
king
king
of
of
Hyrule
Hyrule brought news to
Kingdom of
five other
Hyrule
warriors
as
together
well
to
as
oppose
that
him.
of 5 other warriors and 5 other to help in the fight.
Great
Fight the
evil,
demon
the
king.
demons,
Rauru, to us with
the
secret
attack the innocents who sought the destruction of Hyrule.
Objects that
He was
amplify
our
that
chief
amplified
before
the
his
power
trouble.
of those who chose.
His obsession with power transformed him into a monster.
I bore a secret stone
the first king of Hyrule, and six
Don't
warriors
know that
rode
the demon king's overwhelming power.
I'm proud to have been
His magic was staggering.
We
I was
faced the
unable to
demon
slip
king,
past his
but only after Ra gave us the
not
secret
stop his
stone
progress.
King Rauru realized he would not
that
be
amplified the abilities of
Our
those
leader
who
realized
carried
it would not be possible to defeat the demon
I,
king.
the Sage of Light, fought by my fellow sages in battle with my own self.
Sacrificing himself in the process.
We were no match for his overwhelming
That was
power.
the imprisoning war.
He endured our
The rest
strongest
of us survived
attacks,
that climactic
even the
battle.
lightning strikes I
I
called
would
down.
soon receive a visitor.
King Rauru
Request
knew we had
and
lost
find
the battle
future
against the
The
demons.
sage of time came to visit me, and the
He
destiny
made
of the
the
soul
ultimate
was not
sacrifice
pursued.
to imprison
Was
the
another
demons,
sage of
to
time.
seal him
One
away.
of the sages of time came to me.
Was the imprisoning
King will return. The magic binding him will eventually be undone. When that time comes, a noble swordsman named Link will oppose him. Magic restraining the demon king will be undone. He will return. Link will only succeed
Another
with
of
the
the six
greatest time
sages,
comes. Lend him
the
your
sage
power
of
and
time,
support the
came
Zero's
to
control
visit
over
him.
water.
And she set the
Link
Gerudo
will
on
need
our
help.
destined
Lend
path.
him your power. Your fire. The Goron's mastery of fire.
honor to defeat the Demon
Magic
King.
restraining the
I
demon
swear to you that
will
when the
eventually
Demon
be
King
undone.
returns, the Rito Sage of Wind will awaken
You must
once
help
more.
Link.
I
He's a noble
might not,
swordsman
and you
who
can
will
count
fight
on the
for
full support of the Rito. I swear that when the
need your
Demon King
assistance.
returns, the Sage
Lend him your
of Fire
power.
will
The
awaken
Gerudo's
again.
control of lightning.
The Goron Sage and the
The path
Goron
of the
people will
Gerudo
fight
is
alongside
clear,
your
that is
swordsmen.
true.
I accepted
And of the
on our
destiny
behalf.
of the Zora.
We wish nothing more than to eliminate the demon.
Zora's
There's more to
remains
do
once
than
again
that.
safe.
We are responsible for his very existence in this world, and for that we must make amends. I swear to you, when the Demon King returns, the Gerudo Sage of Lightning will awaken once more.
Stone, and honor the vow I
The
made.
Gerudo Sage and her people will fight alongside your swordsmen.
Alongside the soldiers.
Sage of Time long ago.
And now I have told you all I can of the imprisoning war and of our people's destiny. You have saved Gerudo Town, but the Demon King still remains a threat.
I don't think there is any other word for this but lazy. How else do you explain them reusing the same cutscene that conveys the same information 4 different times? If you want to argue that I should just skip them instead, then why are these cutscenes in the game in the first place if everybody's just going to skip them? Whoever thought this was okay seriously needs some help. Another gripe I have is with the voice acting. Breath of the Wild was the first game in the series to feature voice acting during its major cutscenes, and after seeing how it was handled again in Tears of the Kingdom, I really hope they just stop. The voice performances in both games range from serviceable to poor, with the vast majority of them being mediocre. I didn't think there were any good or great performances in Breath of the Wild, and there was only one voice performance in Tears of the Kingdom that I actually thought was good. I guess you can call that an improvement for Breath of the Wild if you really want to. I'll get more into that later, but for now I want to talk about the mediocre and bad performances. Let's start with Zelda. Despite being one of the leading characters, her voice has not improved at all since Breath of the Wild. Oftentimes it feels very forced and flat, as it's unable to pack any sort of punch during emotional scenes. I wish I could say something more, but again, it's mediocre, so there's no great or terrible moments to point out. It's just kind of there. I can do that for the Great Deku Tree, however, because his voice performance is easily the worst in the game, both in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The biggest issue I have with it is that it's clearly fake. It's just some guy trying to do a wise, mystical tree voice. That doesn't take any kind of specialization. I could do that. Just listen to it and you'll see what I mean.
Great Deku Tree, thank you so much.
Ha ha ha. There is no need for thanks. I merely watched over its renewal.
Great Deku Tree, thank you so much.
Ha ha ha. There is no need for thanks. I merely watched over its renewal.
Zelda,
It is amazing that a sword can heal
favorite?
itself,
Huggy Wuggy,
no matter how badly damaged
Berry
it
Blue,
becomes.
Zombo Sauce.
I understand that voice actors can have ranges, but if the voice sounds forced, then that person should not be used. There's no reason they couldn't have found an older person to do this voice instead, because their voice would be naturally more aged and wiser sounding. It's the difference between doing an old man voice and an actual old man voice. You can tell the difference. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum is Prince Sidon's voice, which is so over the top that I actually ended up liking it because of how funny it was. This sentence right here is my favorite line of dialogue from him. There's nothing inherently funny about it, but the way he says it never fails to make me laugh.
We're partnered up again. Yes. All right, let's head back home.
The voice actor for Sidon also tends to put way too much emphasis on every word in a sentence, and as a result you can get these really unnatural sounding sentences as well.
I am the Sage of Water. Behold, this is my new power.
In the wise words of Tiff, it's one of those things that's so bad it's good. Most of the voice performances in the game fall under these two categories of being either bad or mediocre, and I think this set includes most of the sages, as well as other miscellaneous characters. For voice performances that I find serviceable, I think Rauru and Sonya are good examples. I think their voices fit, but they really aren't amazing. Minoru falls into this category as well, but I appreciate how much more quiet and natural her voice sounds, especially in a flood of overemphasized performances.
I'd like to tinker with it a bit. Would it be okay if I borrow it?
Yes, whatever you need. I really appreciate your help.
But for me, the most disappointing voice performance out of all of them was easily Ganondorf's. This voice was first revealed in one of the trailers for Tears of the Kingdom, and the moment I heard him talk, my heart instantly sank.
Rise, rise, my servants. Sweep over Hyrule. Eliminate this kingdom and her allies.
Cover the land with darkness. Ooh, spooky.
What's funny is that I actually quite like Ganondorf's voice when he's a mummy. It's creepy and unique, but it's also really fitting for this gross reanimated corpse.
Link!
Was that the sword that seals the darkness? The blade that shatters so easily against my power cannot save you from me.
In general, I really wish that this was just Ganondorf's design in Tears of the Kingdom, because it's a lot more visually interesting than a shirtless buff guy. But the problem with Ganondorf's voice in the trailer, and his voice in game, is that there is nothing unique at all about it. It just sounds like a generic, deep, evil guy voice.
It is unfortunate that the noble Zonai no longer grace this world with their presence. All except you and your sister, that is.
It isn't particularly memorable or effective, which does a lot to make his appearance in the game less intimidating. And what makes it even worse is how much better Ganondorf's voice used to be in other 3D Zeldas. If you were unaware, the voice acting in previous Zelda entries was entirely Japanese, which made sense considering that none of the characters really talked, and that voice acting is taken a lot more seriously in Japan than in other places. Rather than tell you why I think Ganondorf's Japanese voice acting is better, I'll show two examples, and you can tell me which one you think is better. After Ganondorf kills Sonia and makes his funny face, he does a maniacal laugh afterwards. Similarly, in Wind Waker, Ganondorf does a maniacal laugh after he loses the Triforce. Let's compare them.
Your Majesty! Queen Sonia! Oh no! Queen Sonia!
To me, one clip shows a generic anime laugh, while the other clip shows a piece of voice work so enthralling that even the actor is swept away by the moment, transcending the medium of voice acting until you can no longer hear the acting, but rather the voice of the character standing before you. I'd also like to point out just how nuanced Ganondorf's voice is. It's very guttural and harsh, arrogant but powerful. When you hear that voice, you know who it belongs to. But when you hear Ganondorf speak in Tears of the Kingdom, that voice could belong to any villain. Even Ganon's voice acting in Ocarina of Time, a game that came out in an age where voice acting in games was often considered a joke, stands head and shoulder above Tears of the Kingdom. This also brings me back to intimidation, or rather Ganondorf's lack of it in Tears of the Kingdom. In Wind Waker, it is established expertly by Link and Ganon's first encounter. This shot represents how far Link even has to go just to be worth standing before Ganondorf, who sees him as such a little threat that he has him tossed out like trash. Even when you come back later to stand before him, Ganondorf's attitude towards Link is still one of inferiority. He calls you boy, and his vocabulary is demeaning, highlighting just how below him you truly are. The moment Link tries to attack him, he is swatted away like a fly, proving that you still aren't ready to face him. These two scenes not only establish Ganondorf as a genuine threat to you and others, but they also create a back and forth dynamic between the player and the villain, a dynamic that can be seen across several other games. Because of the memory system, Ganondorf in Tears of the Kingdom feels really disconnected from the events that are happening in-game. You lose to Ganondorf once at the very beginning, but after that there is an enormous stretch of time between when you next meet, by which point you will have trivialized so many of his monsters that he too will feel inconsequential. Again, if Link and Zelda traded places, this issue could easily solve itself. You would encounter him at the beginning, lose to him in the middle, and then finally beat him at the end. It sucks that he's such a letdown, and even though he's really a pretty simple villain, he has the potential to be really awesome. I've always loved this recurring image of him riding a dark steed through a sea of fire. It's really badass. Even Twilight Princess somehow manages to get away with using Ganondorf for arguably no reason, and without any development across the game, just because his presentation at the end is so good. Maybe it still works because I still feel like Zant is the main villain of Twilight Princess, so getting to fight Ganondorf after you beat him is kinda like the cherry on top. It doesn't really need to be there, but it's still cool that it is. Or maybe I'm just nostalgic, who knows. Either way, Ganondorf's presence in Tears of the Kingdom did not work for me, and as such, I didn't find his boss fight very memorable either. But I also think that this word right here can ruin anything. It's what made me hate the last few areas of Elden Ring, and that's also what made me numb by the end of Tears of the Kingdom. By the time I reached Ganondorf, I no longer cared. All the problems I have with Tears of the Kingdom had worn me down to such a point that I couldn't even give you a fair evaluation of his fight, because the only thing I wanted during the fight with him was for the game to be finally over. No amount of clever writing can fix that. If the world's the same, what's new is boring, the combat is still unpolished, the shrines haven't been made better, the dungeons still suck, and the story is boring, then why should I even care? Once you beat Ganondorf, Zelda is turned back into a human, and Link is magically given his arm back, showing that what little stakes the story did have never truly mattered. So what was the point? Why do I care enough to keep writing this review when Nintendo never even cared in the first place? Perhaps there's some sort of message to be gotten from all of this. Maybe, by hyping up a game so much for so long, your perception of it becomes warped. You want nothing less than perfection. And inevitably, it'll fail to meet those impossible expectations you have created. I'm not sure I fully believe that yet. I still have my hopes. But I'm finding it harder and harder to get excited for things when I'm continuously let down. I have a friend who makes fun of me for often saying that I'm excited for something, but that it'll probably suck when it comes out. But I'd like to point out that skepticism isn't innate. It's something that's developed over time, a product of being let down many, many times over the course of your life. Once you've seen how easy it is for something great to fall, it starts to become expected. Tears of the Kingdom is yet one more thing to add to that long line of disappointments, and my expectations have been dampened so significantly that I can't even say I'm looking forward to the next 3D Zelda game. I'm sure I'll play it, but I have nothing to expect from it. This was meant to be the part of the video where I say that I'm not going to be playing the DLC when it comes out either, but recently Eiji Onuma stated in an interview that there aren't any plans for future DLC, because he feels like they already did everything they could to make a fun sequel in that world. No kidding. But that's not what I wanted in the first place. I was hoping for a new world, regardless of whether it was smaller than the first one, with new things to find, new changes to previous mechanics, cool new dungeons. The reason why I play video games is for those new experiences. Tears of the Kingdom is not one of them.
Honestly, I don't know if I want to even keep playing it at this point. I'm enjoying it, but I know that I'm gonna hit a wall.